Something doesn't quite add up with the narrative that's been floating around the Steelers right now, and if you've been paying attention closely, you've probably heard the same noise. The idea that Aaron Rodgers is delaying his decision to return because of money. But when you really break this down and look at the facts we actually have, that story starts to fall apart pretty quickly. The speculation started gaining traction after Charlie Batch suggested that Rodgers could be pushing for something north of $30 million to come back to Pittsburgh. On the surface, that might sound like a typical negotiation tactic from a veteran quarterback, but when you connect it to Rodgers' recent history and his own words, it just doesn't hold much weight. This is a quarterback who has repeatedly made it clear that money is not driving his decisions at this stage of his career. He has openly said he would play for $10 million or even less, emphasizing that his focus is on the game itself rather than maximizing his earnings. And let's be real about where Rodgers stands financially. He is on the verge of surpassing $400 million in career earnings. That's not just wealth, that's generational security. The idea that an extra $15 or $20 million would suddenly become the deciding factor in whether he plays another season just doesn't align with everything we've seen and heard from him over the past few years. In fact, last season is a perfect example. The Steelers were reportedly willing to offer him more than what he accepted, and he still chose the lower number because, in his own words, he just wanted to play football. So if it's not about money, then what's really going on here? The more believable explanation is much simpler and honestly much more consistent with Rodgers' personality. He's just not ready to commit yet. This is a 22-year veteran who understands exactly what it takes to get through an NFL season, both physically and mentally. Committing too early means locking yourself into that grind, and Rodgers seems like the type who wants to be absolutely certain before making that call. The last thing he wants is to say yes now and then, change his mind in June or July. There's also the offseason factor that people aren't talking about enough. Rodgers values his time away from football, and right now that likely means staying in Malibu, enjoying his personal life, and avoiding the early stages of team activities that frankly don't offer much value to a player of his experience. We're talking about voluntary workouts that consist mostly of meetings, playbook reviews, and light drills. For a quarterback with his level of knowledge, that's not exactly essential. And there's another layer to this. If Rodgers signs early but skips those voluntary sessions, the media narrative instantly flips. Suddenly he's being labeled a bad teammate, criticized for not showing up, and dragged into unnecessary drama. By waiting until he's truly ready to return, he avoids all of that and walks in fully committed, with no questions about his dedication. Now, while that situation continues to unfold, there are other developments quietly taking shape around the roster. There have been whispers about a potential trade with the Denver Broncos, and two names have come up, Marvin Mims Jr. and Ben Powers. Neither move would be a blockbuster, but both could have very specific roles in strengthening this team. Mims in particular is interesting. He's currently more of a backup in Denver, especially after their recent additions, which could make him available at a relatively low cost. And what he brings is something the Steelers' offense could definitely use. Speed. Real game-breaking speed. He's not the most polished route runner, but he excels at stretching the field, tracking deep balls, and adding explosiveness to the passing game. Pairing that kind of vertical threat with the existing weapons could open things up in a big way. On the other hand, Ben Powers represents a different kind of value, a veteran presence on the offensive line, someone who could step in and potentially stabilize the left guard position. Even after signing Brock Hoffman, there's still room for competition and depth, and Powers could provide both. With multiple late-round picks available, this is the kind of low-risk move that could quietly improve the roster heading into the season. At the same time, free agency rumors are swirling, but not all of them feel grounded in reality. Christian Wilkins, for example, is drawing interest from a large number of teams, but considering his injury situation and the current depth of the Steelers' defensive line, it's hard to see Pittsburgh making a serious push there. The same goes for Odell Beckham Jr., whose name keeps resurfacing despite a lack of actual movement. If the Steelers didn't bring him in when their receiver room was at its weakest, it's tough to justify that happening now. One name that does make more sense, though, is Taylor Decker. A veteran left tackle with over a decade of starting experience, Decker could provide immediate depth and competition at a position that still carries some uncertainty. He's not at his peak anymore, but he doesn't need to be. What he offers is stability, experience, and a reliable reliable option if younger players aren't ready or if injuries become an issue. When you step back and look at the full picture, this feels like a team that is carefully positioning itself. They're not making desperate moves, they're not overreacting to speculation, and they're not forcing decisions before they need to be made. Everything still seems to revolve around that one major question. When Aaron Rodgers decides he's ready, will he come back fully committed for one more run? And that's where I want to bring this back to you, because this situation is far from resolved. If you had to read between the lines right now, do you believe Rodgers is just taking his time before returning, or is there something bigger going on behind the scenes that we're not seeing yet? Because if you keep following the trail here, everything about this situation continues to point in one very specific direction, and it's not the one that's been getting all the headlines. The Steelers are operating like a team that expects Aaron Rodgers to return. Not hopes, not guesses, expects. And there's a difference. You don't stay this patient at the quarterback position. You don't avoid making aggressive moves. And you don't structure the rest of your offseason this way unless you have a strong level of internal confidence about how this is going to play out. Think about it. If there were real concern inside the building that Rodgers might walk away, we would be seeing a very different approach right now. There would be urgency. There would be contingency plans becoming visible. Maybe a more aggressive pursuit of another veteran quarterback, or even a stronger push toward drafting one early. But instead, everything feels controlled, almost calculated. And that brings us back to the timing of all this. Rodgers isn't rushing, and the Steelers aren't rushing him. That tells you there's an understanding between both sides, even if nothing is officially signed yet. It's almost like both parties know where this is heading. They're just waiting for the right moment to make it final. Now at the same time, the front office is doing exactly what it should be doing, preparing the roster so that when that decision does come, the team is ready to compete immediately. And that's where these smaller moves and rumors start to matter more than people think. Take the potential addition of someone like Marvin Mims Jr. again. This isn't just about adding depth. It's about adding a very specific type of weapon that complements a quarterback like Rodgers, a vertical threat who can stretch defenses, create space underneath, and punish teams that try to stack the box or play aggressively. That's the kind of piece that doesn't just fill a roster spot, it enhances the entire structure of the offense. The same logic applies to the offensive line discussions. Whether it's exploring a trade for Ben Powers or considering a veteran like Taylor Decker, the goal is clear. Build stability up front, because if Rodgers does come back, the last thing you want is uncertainty protecting him. At this stage of his career, the margin for error gets smaller. Protection, consistency, and communication along the line become even more critical. And there's another subtle detail here that shouldn't be overlooked. The Steelers are keeping their flexibility. They're not locking themselves into long-term commitments that could backfire. One-year deals, low-risk trades, depth additions, these are all moves that keep the door open while still improving the team. It's a very deliberate strategy. Meanwhile, the noise around players like Odell Beckham Jr. and Christian Wilkins feels more like external pressure than internal intent. Agent-driven narratives, off-season hype cycles, things we see every year. And Pittsburgh, to its credit, doesn't seem to be biting on those distractions. They're staying focused on fits, value, and timing. So when you connect all these dots, the picture becomes a lot clearer. This isn't a team scrambling for answers. This is a team waiting for its final piece to fall into place. And that piece is still Aaron Rodgers. The real question now isn't if he comes back, it's when. And maybe even more importantly, what version of Rodgers are you getting when he does return? A fully committed veteran chasing one last championship run, or someone who needed this extra time to make sure he still has that fire? Because if it's the first version, then everything the Steelers are quietly building right now starts to make a lot more sense. The added speed, the reinforced offensive line, the patience at quarterback, it all points toward one final push. But if there's hesitation, if there's doubt, if this decision drags deeper into the offseason, then the pressure starts to shift. Not just on Rodgers, but on the entire organization to adapt quickly. And that's where this becomes one of the most fascinating storylines in the entire NFL right now. A future Hall of Fame quarterback, a team that looks ready to compete, and a decision that could shape the entire season. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the Steelers are making the right move by staying patient and building around the expectation that Rodgers returns? Or should they be more aggressive and start preparing for a future without him right now? And here's where things take an even more interesting turn, because the longer this situation stretches out, the more it starts to test not just the patience of the front office, but the confidence of the locker room and the fan base as well. You can already feel it building. Every day without a decision adds another layer of speculation, another round of debates, another wave of questions about what the Steelers are really planning. And while internally they may feel calm about the situation, externally that uncertainty starts to create pressure. But here's the key detail that shouldn't be overlooked. This is not unfamiliar territory for this organization. The Steelers have dealt with high-profile situations before, and one thing they've consistently done is avoid making emotional decisions. They don't panic. They don't chase headlines. They stick to their structure. And right now, that structure is being put to the test. Because while all signs may point to Rodgers eventually returning, there is always that small percentage of doubt that you can't ignore. And in the NFL, that small percentage can completely change the direction of a season. If for any reason Rodgers decides not to come back, everything we've been talking about, the patience, the roster construction, the calculated moves, suddenly gets reevaluated under a completely different lens. That's why these secondary moves matter even more than they appear on the surface. Adding depth to the offensive line isn't just about protecting Rodgers, it's about protecting whoever ends up under center. Exploring options at wide receiver isn't just about maximizing the passing game, it's about creating flexibility in case the offense needs to evolve. Even the decision to avoid risky signings in free agency speaks to a bigger philosophy. Stay adaptable, and adaptability might end up being the most important trait this team has going into the 2026 season. Because let's play this out for a second. If Rodgers returns, you're looking at a team that has quietly built a balanced roster. You've got weapons on offense, you've got depth in the trenches, and you've got a defense that already has a strong foundation. That's a team that can compete. But if he doesn't, then suddenly those same moves become the foundation for a different kind of team. One that might lean more on the run game, on defense, on controlling tempo. It's a completely different identity, but one that the Steelers could still realistically execute if they've prepared correctly. And that's why the front office approach right now feels so intentional. They're not just building for one outcome, they're building for multiple possibilities without compromising either path. At the same time, you can't ignore the human element in all of this. Players notice what's happening, they hear the rumors, they understand what Rodgers would bring to this team, and they also understand what his absence would mean. That kind of uncertainty can either become a distraction or a motivator, depending on how it's handled. If Rodgers walks back into that locker room fully committed, that instantly elevates the energy, the belief, the expectations. It sends a message that this team is all in right now. But if the decision drags too long, or if it goes the other way, then leadership inside that locker room becomes even more important. Veterans have to step up. Coaches have to reinforce the vision. Because at that point, it's no longer about waiting, it's about moving forward. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from everything we've discussed. This isn't just about one player making a decision. It's about how an entire organization positions itself around uncertainty, and how it responds when that uncertainty finally turns into clarity. The Steelers are walking a very fine line right now. Stay patient, but not passive. Stay prepared, but not overcommitted. Stay confident, but not blind to the risks. And depending on how this plays out, we could be looking back at this exact moment as the turning point of their season. So now I'll leave you with this. If you're in charge and you're watching this situation unfold exactly like it is right now, do you stick with the current plan